Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yulia Ivanuk, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. I would like to start by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dana peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to the QX lecture series, and it is my great honor to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Marsha Forchuk Skrypuch, to discuss her new book, WINTERKILL. Marsha Skrypuch is a Ukrainian Canadian author acclaimed for her nonfiction and historical fiction, including Silver Threads, Enough, Making Bombs for Hitler, The War Below, Stolen Girl, Don't Tell the Nazis, Trapped in Hitler's Web, and Traitors Among Us. She was awarded the Order of Princess Olha by the President of Ukraine for her writing. Marsha lives in Brantford, Ontario, and we are so honored to have her join us our webinar here today. Pani Skrypuch, the digital floor is all yours.
Thank you, Yulia. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's also really nice to speak to adults. I speak to a lot of kids, and actually I spoke to two different groups of students today already. So it's very nice to speak to adults. So I want to tell you a little bit about WINTERKILL, and then we can open it up for questions because I'd love to hear your questions. But one of the things that a lot of people ask is, why did I name it WINTERKILL? And, you know, it's out now, and it just seems like such an appropriate title for what's happening in Ukraine at this very moment, doesn't it? And it's also appropriate for what was happening in Ukraine during the Holodomor. But WINTERKILL, if you're a farmer, you know that it's got a different meaning as well. And when you grow winter wheat, one of the big risks is WINTERKILL, because winter wheat was planted in November, and then it had to sit underneath the snow during the winter, and then you would know in the spring whether you were going to have a crop or not. Because if there was a thaw at the wrong time, then the seedlings would die, and then you would have to plant something else that wouldn't be nearly as good as winter wheat, because that is like the gold standard of wheat, and that was what was growing in Ukraine at the time. But the book actually starts with the main character, Neil, who was the guy standing in the back, with his father as they leave their field, and it's never mentioned that they're checking for WINTERKILL because I cut that part out. And then when they get down to their own town, and there's like the main street in their small town, they meet this girl, Alice, who's a Canadian. But what they're encountering her more than meeting her. And what it is there's this entire group of young pioneers and other uniformed communist activists marching down their street. So they've basically been invaded by these young activists. They don't see that they have guns. What they see is that they have pamphlets and pieces of paper. And so Neil and his father follow behind, and then when they get to their own house, they realize that their house has basically been invaded too. Alice and her father, the two Canadians, go into the house before they do. And Alice, who's the same age as Neil, is doing an inventory of their house, writing down everything that's there. And the father is just talking the glories of communism. So that's how the book starts. And I wanted to have a Canadian connection to this story because I'm Canadian. Also, my grandfather, who came to Canada before the First World War, was a card-carrying communist. He also was buried as Comrade Forchuk. And he was wrong, and he knew he was wrong. And what made him realize he was wrong about his political affiliations was the Holodomor. But he had actually applied to go back to the Soviet Union to find his family because he had lost track of his mother and sister during World War I, and the revolution and the revolution, right? And so he thought joining the Communist Party would be a way of finding his family. But also when he got out of the internment camp, the churches turned their back a lot on those men who had been interned in World War I. And the communists opened up their soup kitchens for them. So that happened. So for me, I thought that that was an interesting thing because, you know, one thing that I don't like about a lot of Holodomor literature that I've read, it's sort of like the black hats and the white hats. You do this thing where there's near the twain shall meet, and they're the good guys and the bad guys and all this. And I think that that's a false narrative. There are a lot of people who may begin thinking that they're doing the right thing and then realize that they have been duped by propaganda. And I think that we all are at risk of that happening. But anyway, so that's the premise of the book. And that was what I was thinking of as I began to write the book. One thing that a lot of people ask is, why did you write a book like this for young people and not adults? And the reason that I wrote this for young people is because, first off, 50% of the readership of a book like this is adult. A lot of adult readers know that they can have a quick, accurate, compelling page turner if it's written for kids, whereas if you're getting a book on the same topic for adults, sometimes it's not quite as compelling because kids are really picky readers. And so if you can hold a kid's interest, then you can certainly hold an adult's interest. So they just know that. But the other reason that I particularly like to write for young people is because writing for young people, writers for young people are held to a higher standard than adult writers. And what I mean by that is that my history and my research must be accurate, especially when you're talking about something like the Holodomor that is contested history. And I have to say that any topic that is on a Ukrainian topic is by definition contested history. So when you're writing for adults, you can make things up. I consider a lot of adult historical fiction to be historical fantasy. I will not pick up a book if on the cover it has a woman in a red coat and you see her from the back and she's looking into the distance at a horizon, and it's called something like The Librarian of Auschwitz, or it's called the daughter of I don't know what, but it's always something to do with a historical time, and it's either a wife or a daughter or something female like that. Guaranteed that's going to be historical fantasy. And I'm not interested in historical fantasy. I want to write history. So every single scene, every single incident that is in WINTERKILL is based on primary documents or just really good research. So my research Bible was actually Red Famine by Anne Applebaum. You can see all my sticky notes there. But I didn't stop there. Of course, I didn't stop there. But one of the things that I did when I read Anne Applebaum was use her bibliography, and I got those books, and I got their bibliography, and I got those documents. Because I think that to do really good research when you're writing historical fiction, you need to look at the documents that who you're basing your stuff on used to see whether they are actually accurate in their interpretation, because oftentimes, you know, between this and this, there's a lot of little funny stuff that goes on, especially when you're talking about something like disputed history. And as I say, that's anything that's Ukrainian history. So that's why I write for young people. The other thing, like, why did I write about the Holodomor? This isn't the first time. So my first book that I wrote about the Holodomor was Enough, picture book illustrated by Michael Marchenko. And this came out 22 years ago. Can you believe it? And when it came out, I had death threats and hate mail. And I don't like death threats and hate mail. I mean, who does? But the thing is if you get that, then you know that you're writing on something important and that it needs to be written. But also, it made me know, like, I had to write something else, but I didn't really want to. And so one of the things that I tried to do, I run an online critique group, and I have for a number of decades. And so there were people in my critique group over the years who were writing novels set during the Holodomor. So I felt, well, maybe I've done my part and I've written this. Maybe other people can write on the Holodomor too. And so I supported them in their writing. One of those writers, actually, his book is coming out this week. It just came out. His name is Adrian Lysenko, and it's 5 stalks of grain. And he's doing a webinar tonight with Crec Ed, and I strongly urge you to go to that webinar. It's a graphic novel, so it has a slightly different audience than mine, and it's just fantastic. But I have another person in there who is writing a novel set during the Holodomor, and I had someone before her who did. But these books aren't out, and we need this information out. And so when Scholastic approached me and asked me to write on the Holodomor, what I did was I went back to the person who was writing a similar one to me, and I said to her, I have been asked, and I said, if your book comes out at the same time as mine, we'll do co-promotion, because I don't believe in competing against my fellow authors ever. I believe in supporting and elevating, but her book hasn't got published yet. And this is the problem with Ukrainian topics. It's really hard to get them published. And so I'm so very grateful that my 6 World War II novels set during, published by Scholastic have done so well. Because what it does is it gives me a platform to write something like WINTERKILL set during a time that most publishers would avoid with a 10-foot pole, especially a publisher like Scholastic in the US, which is the biggest children's publisher in the world. So I'm really thrilled that WINTERKILL has such a huge platform like this, because it's a subject that everybody needs to know about. And especially right now with this war that's happening right now. But I mean, I didn't write this while the war was on. It was finished in January. I was still doing some of the last edits, and I was just, it just makes me sick to my stomach, as it does all of us. But particularly because there are scenes in WINTERKILL that feel so horribly familiar to the war. And so the thing that is good about that, if there can be anything good about the Holodomor and writing about it in the war, is that reading WINTERKILL gives young people context for what's happening now. Because if you don't have context and you don't realize that there was another dictator in Moscow who was also trying to obliterate the Ukrainian nation, then you may think that, I don't know what you would think, but you wouldn't really be able to look at the situation that's happening in Ukraine right now and have a balanced idea of what's going on. So WINTERKILL has been, for me, an entry to talking to young people about the war in Ukraine, to give them context to what's happening. And people are blown away, like just the emails that I get from educators. They're just blown away by their kids, their students' response, because they're making the connections between history and current events. Now, I'm going to stop talking right there, because I'm hoping that you guys have some questions for me. I see many.
Thank you so much, Pani Skrypuch, for this great presentation and for your captivating book, WINTERKILL, which will shape and guide our discussion today. So now I'd like to open the floor for discussion. Feel free to either submit your questions into the Q&A chat box or just raise your hand. I already see quite a few hands raised, so that's really good. So let's just start the discussion. So Pani Angie, would you like to ask your question? And let me allow you to unmute yourself. You should be able to go ahead now.
There. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Marsha, for writing books for the middle years. There are many adults who are not university grads or even grade 12 grads. And I don't know if it's still true, but we were always told that the Reader's Digest is for grade 6 literate level. And I'm not saying your book was a grade 6 level, but it's easy for me as an educator and a friend to say, this book will only take you this, so long to read, or you'll get the story, or you'll have an understanding, because most non-Ukrainians don't want to spend for 40 hours reading a book trying to understand what's going on in Ukraine right now. But if I tell them, you know what, Mary Michela has written a book, Dear's Dido, the Holodomor story, or there's one, I think is the 5 Grains of Wheat or something. There's that children's book. There's, your books, and our library has them. Go into the children's section, ask the librarian for these kind of books, and they're more likely to do that when, or if I say, well, read Bloodlands or Borderlands, because it ain't going to happen. I know it, because it's hard enough for me to read that. So I want to thank you for that. But I now want to challenge you, because I understand why a Canadian father and daughter were in this story. And that really perplexed me. I didn't like that we had Canadians who were communists. And I know we had Canadians who were communists, and probably still today. But it just didn't. But then I thought, well, okay, she's writing for that group. Yeah, making that connection. But where I saw the connection, and I want you to write about her, is this Rhea Kleiman.
Well, she is in the book.
Yes, but there's no storybooks written about her, because I went looking for her. I knew nothing about her. I knew about the Americans and the Welsh fellow, the reporter that was eventually killed. I knew, but I started reading about this Rhea Kleiman, and I thought, that Marsha Skrypuch, she should be writing a book about her, because she's Canadian, Polish Canadian, and oh my goodness, what that lady did, and how come I don't know about her. So that's my reflection.
Well, absolutely, I would like to write about her, but to come back to writing about communist Canadians of Ukrainian heritage, we have to look at ourselves with all the warts. And if we polish up our history, then we can't be surprised when other people polish down our history. So I think that it's really important to stick to the truth. And the communist movement in Canada was quite vigorous. And it was the Holodomor, and of course it wasn't called that back then, but that is what basically tore it apart too, because people would come back, the eyewitnesses would come back, and they would do one or the other things. They would all either have seen it, and this includes Ukrainians, they would see it and deny that it happened. And others would have seen it and tried to get people to understand what was going on and saying, we were wrong. And so there were even confrontations in the street, and this even happened in Winnipeg, where people who had witnessed the Holodomor and had talked about it at the time, the communists threw rocks at them in the streets as they were trying to get this word out. So yes, it's an ugly history, but it's true. And I will not whitewash history. I may write for young people, but that doesn't mean that I, put pink elephants in the room, because I'm just not going to do that. And also my own grandfather was a member of the Communist Party of Canada, and he was buried as Comrade Forchuk. Now, that was something that I had a lot of trouble reconciling myself with. But on the other hand, also, and you probably know this already if you've read the acknowledgements in the back of my book, I'm very upfront with the fact that the very first time that I voted for the Communist Party of Canada. It was me and the candidate. We were the only ones that were stupid enough to do that, but we did. And so I could see myself being someone like Alice, to get all caught up in something that sounds so good, because honestly, communism sounds good on paper. And especially if you are in Canada, it does. It's not the same thing if you're living through Stalinism and if you're living from the other side, because you do see the terror. But what you saw in North America, there was a whole movement, and it wasn't just Canadians, it was Americans. There were whole sports teams that up and went there because they thought it was going to be a utopia. So if you just go through the daily newspapers of the time, you'll see all these puff pieces about how wonderful Stalinism was, how wonderful it was, the collectivization, how wonderful it was, like they were building a new world. And so for me, I think that I have a moral responsibility of shedding light on that. It's the same thing, the Kharkiv tractor factory being built. I mean, Rhea Kleiman herself talked about Alice coming to her door and begging for bread, and identified her as Canadian. And that was my inspiration for the book. But also the fact that her father worked at that tractor factory. And then when I did research myself, I found out that it wasn't even built at the time that she would have come, according to Rhea's own newspaper article. So that's why I started the book where it was, because I want it to be as historically accurate as possible, which meant that I had to include the part of the building of the tractor factory. So I was trying very much to avoid writing the same Holodomor novel that has been written over and over and over again, because I'm sorry, and I don't mean to criticize my fellow writers, but I'm just pointing out that there's a certain story arc that is always told. And it's fine, but it's like, there's the good guys and the bad guys, and the bad guys are almost cartoonish characters, and the good guys are always Ukrainian. And all the deaths are really, they talk about 10 million. Like, why do you just say millions? So there's all these things that we do that basically diminishes the victims of this. I'm not going to do that. I'm also never going to put an overlay of romance on something like the Holodomor, because let's just talk about what's going on here. There's no cannibalism in my book, and I would not do that. And any of you who have read the book, you probably recognize the place where you thought I was going to go there and I didn't go there. And the reason that I won't go there is because I feel that that's another way of dehumanizing Ukrainians. Because so millions of people died. What does everybody talk about? Cannibalism. Why? Because that dehumanizes them. Who cares about them anymore? It's the same thing like all the on Twitter sphere today, everybody talking about Zelensky as a war criminal because of the apparent friendly fire that probably still was. It was probably Russian hit. It probably wasn't a Ukrainian, but we won't get into that. But in any case, now they're saying, Zelensky is a war criminal because there were, the deaths in Poland, right? It's the same thing. You go off on a tangent and you get distracted by the sparkly thing in the corner and you forget the main thing that's happening. So I will never do that. I will always maintain the dignity of my characters. And that's also one of the reasons that I write for young people, because it's easier to maintain the dignity of your parents by doing your characters by doing that, because you don't have to put in all the titillating stuff. There's no need for sex. There's no need for romance. You don't have to have a mystery. You don't have to do all the things that an adult audience needs to keep them on the shiny paper.
Thank you so much. And Pani Rose, would you like to go next as your question?
Well, it's more a comment. I like what you say about black and white and right and wrong. This kind of thinking is really prevalent today, and it's caused a lot of discord and hostility and even estrangements within families. And you point this out in your book with the sister who has decided to go over to the communist way of thinking. But it's a huge problem on social on the social media, and people don't seem to want to see the other side. Everybody's got to be divided into left or right, and it's something that has really bothered me.
I agree with you, Rose. It bothers me too. And when I was writing WINTERKILL, that was something that was very much on my mind. And I thought, if I want people to understand other points of view, then I had darn well better be humble enough to understand my own prejudices. And so that's one of the reasons that I was really honest in the back part of the book, in the acknowledgements, about my own culpability. And I'm pretty ashamed of voting communist. And like my husband said, why did you put that in? And I said, because I did. That's what I did. So I made a mistake. If we can't admit that we made a mistake, then why are we on any kind of high horse about anybody else's beliefs? And especially when you're writing something like this, because the pivotal moment in WINTERKILL is when Alice understands what a huge, massive error she has made and her father has made, and any kind of reparation that they do cannot even hold a candle to the damage that they've done. But we all need to do that. We all need to look and review what we've done and to think about the damage that we may have done, even inadvertently. And if we can't do that, then we have no right to expect it of others. So thank you. I appreciate your comment because I feel exactly the same way.
Thank you so much for this response. And I'd be really curious to hear you expand further on the character of Yulia, Neil's sister, who became a Soviet collaborator in a way. And did you have a chance to think about what happens to Neil and his sister after the story ends?
Oh, I was working on a companion novel, so a continuation of the story, when the war broke out, and then I had to set it aside because my heart couldn't. I can't write about the Stalin terror years while Putin is doing the Putin terror years. So it's aside. But yes, I have been thinking a lot about that. And also, I didn't know that Yulia was going to do that until she up and said it. Because when I write a book, I don't plan it out that carefully. What I do is I do the historical research. So it's like a canvas for my story. And then I create the characters, but I create them with enough white space that as I'm writing, I let them have autonomy. And my husband says, don't say that out loud because people will think you need medication. But there again, you know, I just say all sorts of things that I probably shouldn't. And this is being recorded. That's Marsha, you know, what can I say? But anyways, she shocked me when she did that. But she did it because that was true to her character, the way that she was just absolutely entranced with Alice's pin, you know, her Lenin pin that was in English, and the way that she thought that, you know, the red sash that her brother thinks is the devil's noose was just so fashionable. Well, isn't that what propaganda is all about? And successful propaganda is to get people interested in this. And I had just written Traitors Among Us and also Trapped in Hitler's Web. Trapped in Hitler's Web, there's the one character, Sophia, who is in the Hitler Youth. Parallels are, you know, almost identical between Hitler Youth and the Young Pioneers. So she would have done that. And I have this image in my head of her sitting on one of those things in the fields, you know, those really tall observation sites that they had, watching so that she could either shoot people who were trying to steal grain or report them or whatever. But I just had this image. It never got into the book. But in the next book, I'm really curious what she is going to do when she realizes what she did. It's the same thing. I am curious about Alice when she gets back home, because will people believe her? Even with the pictures, because, you know, people can see the pictures and they still don't believe it.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to reading the next book. You have mentioned in the introduction session that pretty much any Ukrainian topic is contested history. Found this point extremely interesting. Your book has a chapter titled Useful Fools. We still have quite a few people today that fail to understand what's really happening on the ground in Ukraine. How do we make sure that the truth gets out? And how are challenges that we are experiencing in the informational domain similar and different back then versus today?
So the thing that Stalin did back then, the most successful thing that Stalin did was to kill all the writers. And so that helps Putin now because there just aren't that many writers of Ukrainian topics. And the Ukrainian writers that we do have, and we have a number in the audience I'm seeing, hello, and I admire you so much, write nonfiction. But the way to really get people to understand things, in my opinion, is you also have to write stories, so fiction, but based on reality. And if you have stories, people are able to have empathy much better than if they're just reading history. But the thing is that it's a very successful thing to kill everybody who can do that, right? And I like Polish diaspora is in the same problem as the Ukrainian diaspora, is that there's just not a lot of people who are doing historical fiction, creative nonfiction novels. They're just not. And even when they are, they can't get a publisher, because you can't get a publisher on a topic if no one has written on that topic before. So, you know, it just makes it really daunting. So that's really the most effective way to break propaganda, is to have stories that people can really plunge themselves into and understand on their own level, because they bought into the story. I also think that Putin has done the best PR job for Ukrainians of anyone, because, you know, he called us Nazis, and then you go and look at what he's doing. He saying he's liberating the country, and then you see Baba's holding, you know, the tanks with their bare hands. So he has done the very best job at completely obliterating all the lies that have been told about Ukrainians. And then he says we're anti-Semitic and there's Zelensky, right? Oh my gosh. But the propaganda keeps on going, and I'm sure that any of you in the audience who writes on Ukrainian topics is the object of all sorts of hate even now. One thing that I get sort of on an ongoing basis, so someone went into my Wikipedia page and changed Ukrainian to Russian. I noticed it and changed it back. And then on Goodreads reviews and on Amazon reviews, they'll just every once in a while post something like "kill yourself" or call me a Nazi cool, you know, this kind of thing. And usually you can get those deleted. I don't think that any of them are still showing anymore. But everybody who is writing on these topics will get that. I know that I'm not unusual in that at all. And so these things happen. And what it does is it means that a lot of people are fearful of writing on these things. And so the only way to really fight back against that is to like set the fear aside and do it anyway. But also the Ukrainian community really needs to encourage and support those who are writing on these topics so that more people know about it.
Thank you so much for these important remarks. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to either write them in the chat box or raise your hand. And for now, I'll continue with the question that I was personally thinking a lot about. In your book, we see genocide, use of food as a weapon, destruction of cultural heritage, linguicide, change in school curriculum. So all of these categories that are so vividly described in the book are once again taking place in Ukraine as a result of Russia's atrocious invasion and occupation in some parts of Ukraine.
Yes.
Could you please expand on how history and reality collides and how it has recently collided?
Yes, and that's a really good question, because when I was writing this, I had no idea what Putin was going to be up to a year later, because this book, the first complete draft of it was finished in June of 2021. So I just had no idea. And I just find it stunning that he's using the same playbook back then. And one of the things that I had difficulty with when I was writing was making sure that the terms that I was using to describe the people who were doing the things wouldn't confuse the reader, because they were called activists back then, right? And so they were called many different things. So I stuck to shock workers and Stalinists, even though that's not the most common terms. But Putin is doing the same thing. You know, he talks about liberating Ukraine. Well, he's not liberating, but he's using all the same things. Like he's using terms as weapons and terms of liberation as weapons. And that's what was happening in during the Holodomor too, is like the words that were being said were for evil actions, but thinking that if you say the words enough, people will think that the evil action is somehow a liberation. Just talking about one of my other books for a moment, Traitors Among Us, is set just after World War II and is about the silence camps. And that is going on as well, because, you know, as the civilians are being kidnapped and the children are being kidnapped, and they're being taken to interrogation camps and filtration camps. And that's what was happening in Traitors Among Us. The two sisters in those books thought that they were safe because they were in an American refugee camp, and they're kidnapped by the Soviets and taken across to be interrogated in a silence camp. But how many people have ever heard of silence camps post-World War II in the Soviet zone? I haven't seen a book on that. And so, you know, this is the problem. The reason that Putin can get away with a lot of this stuff is because we don't know our own history. And so with WINTERKILL being out, and I'm doing presentations through with the Holodomor Foundation, holodomor.ca. It's amazing. The kids are making the connections themselves. So, you know, we talk about the book, and then they ask me about, you know, what Putin is doing. And they look at the map in the back of WINTERKILL, and then they look at the map that's on CNN about where things are happening, right? And they make the connections themselves because they can see that it is, you know, where ethnic Ukrainians are is where the killing is happening during the Holodomor. And, you know, the same thing happening right now. The borders, everything is all the same. I wonder why Putin doesn't have a creative like bone in his body, because, you know, really, I guess that's why he's in so much trouble too.
Thank you, Pani Skrypuch. So what else can we do or should we do to expand the knowledge of the Holodomor in North America and beyond, around the world, outside of the Ukrainian community?
Well, having popular literature helps a lot. And I'm really glad that there is now a critical mass of popular literature being created on the topic. Because if you've got popular literature and then you've got movies on it, and you've got, so it's something that people need to be able to put themselves into the shoes of. And until you have like vehicles that people can put themselves into so that they have empathy for this, there's not going to be an acknowledgement of it, right? So this is the thing about the Holocaust is that there are so many creative works set during the Holocaust that I don't know that there's anyone in the English-speaking world for sure who could credibly claim that they've never heard of it before. But it's because there's so many brilliant writers and there's so many phenomenal movies that are written on that topic. That's what we need to do. We need to do the same thing. We need to develop the creative minds that are within our community, and not just in our community, but have people of other heritages look at what's happening to us. Now, the other thing that I do too, and I feel very strongly about this, I think that it is a mistake to always look inwards. And so I write about topics that are not Ukrainian. And in fact, I did first, before I ever tackled the Holodomor, I wrote a trilogy set during the Armenian genocide, and I am not Armenian. But Armenians in World War I were also deprived of food and water and marched into the desert in circles until they died. And that was a genocide that had not been written about. And I had a moral responsibility to write about it because it wasn't something that people were writing about. And similarly to Ukrainian culture, there were historians, many academics, many historians of Armenian heritage, but there weren't a lot of creative writers, and the creative writers were avoiding this topic. So I felt that I was just going to plunge in And so I've written a trilogy, and then I wrote 2 other books, and then I wrote another book that kind of combined a whole pile of things: internment and the Armenian genocide, Ukrainian internment and the Armenian genocide together. This book, Dance of the Banished. But if we are not willing to empathize and explore the cultural devastation of the other people, then we can't expect anyone to care about what happened in our history. I think that is a really important thing too.
Thank you so much once again for your important work and for these remarks. And I can see that Rose had another question. Would you like to go ahead with it? Oh no, that's just a raised hand. Okay, that must be from the previous one. Pani Skrypuch, then I have a question. Do you have any recommendations, tools, or best practices to recommend on how we can expose children to knowledge of history, in particular the painful events from history, conscientiously and age appropriately?
So the Holodomor Foundation has a really good education website, and I just want to hold this up because it does have the URL right there. So even just go to holodomor.ca, and then after that, you'll see that there's the education portal. They have all sorts of teachers' guides on the Holodomor. The other thing that they have on the holodomor.ca part of it is a lot of primary documents. And so young people of all ages, but also adults, can go there and they can find out stuff on the Holodomor in terms of photographs that are accurate and have been geolocated. There's also testimony from Holodomor survivors that like PDF files that are searchable by word. So you can find some, you know, if you are looking for a particular village and you want to know what happened from someone's own memory, then this is just a phenomenal resource. So I use this a lot myself. The maps there, the photographs are just phenomenal. But on the education side, they also have teachers' guides, which are wonderful, and all sorts of different resources like that. They've also got taped webinars there. So like I would say for young people and for their educators, this is one of the best sites in English available, you know, worldwide, really. There's just nothing like holodomor.ca in terms of the collection of information that they have for the regular public. In terms of other topics, that's a real tough one, you know, and in terms of Ukrainian topics in particular, I don't know, because there's not a lot of material. I don't know of any place that someone can go to, like a portal for World War II in Ukraine that is geared towards young people. I don't know. I just don't know. But I will tell you that when I speak to kids, very few kids don't know about making bombs for Hitler. And making bombs for Hitler, even when I go to Ukrainian schools, it's interesting because if I go to a Ukrainian school and I speak and it's like an event at night and the parents are there, they may not have heard of making bombs for Hitler, but all the kids do. And it's not because that anyone taught it to them on purpose. It's because they got it at their scholastic book fair. And so for me, I find that one of the very best vehicles for educating kids about these topics is to write something that's so engaging, kids buy it with their own money, as opposed to something that's taught to them. Because if someone is reading it because they like that author, then it will have a much bigger effect on them for their entire life than just something that they were taught.
Thank you. And Pani Olena, please go ahead with your question.
Hello, everyone. I'm very glad and thankful to everyone that you're not keep silent and discuss such very important questions, especially for us these days. And as for question of kids' education, it's also very important. For example, as I'm from Ukraine, and it's very difficult for us these days. And I have a 9-year-old daughter, and also I think that we shouldn't just keep silence. Yes, it's very difficult to discuss it because now our Ukrainian children are engaged in all kinds of activities. Just they get the money, they just want to help how they can to support Ukrainian army and to support Ukrainian kids and to support just Ukraine in general. And I think that it just like my idea, my experience, we should read with them. We should watch all these documentaries, even all this awful news these days. We should support our children because all the time they have a lot of questions and we should explain to them. And sometimes, of course, when we visit Main Street, our Ukrainian National Federation, we can see there are sometimes strange photos of some children, yes, but our children should see it, and all children all over the world should know. But we should support them as educators, as maybe teachers at school, as just parents, and explain them all the time that how it goes and how can we prevent it. And maybe because you see, I was born in Soviet Union in 70s and these topics were prohibited at all in my family, for example, and at school. And just in 90s I started maybe at just the beginning of 90s I started to read myself these things and to discover a lot of things. And I have just discovered a lot of things being here in Canada, when I can see some things from the other side, you see. It's very interesting. And I do understand, I do recommend not to keep silence. I think so, just my idea. Thank you very much for your support.
Olena, I agree with you completely. And I especially like your point about talking to kids, talking to your kids as they read something. So even and reading together, I think that is really important. And you know, it goes beyond Ukrainian topics, which of course is so essential, but also just for a love of reading. If a parent and child read together, both will be more passionate readers, will find joy in reading, but you're also spending time with your kids, but also you are learning this history, and they're able to ask questions that they may not ask their teacher, and it may not be a book that they would have in school anyway. So to be able to open up about that, it is really good. And it also shows the importance of books when you do that, and perhaps encourages that child to think of writing when they get older, because I really would love to see more Ukrainian writers in English. I get really lonely. It's so frustrating because we need these stories, and we need kids to be able to read these stories. In particular, we need stories that don't go out of print so that people can keep on going back to the same one again and again and again, and enjoy it, and kids know it. And I would love to see Canadian classics that are written by a whole pile of Ukrainians. Wouldn't that be awesome?
Yeah, thank you very much. And if it's possible, I would like to add something about reading. And now in the Canadian school, also my daughter likes to visit library, and sometimes she brings some books, and she likes such series of books, Canadian Girls. It's just about 9-10 years old girls and their story. And their stories about what times, about some difficulties that they had before immigrating, and while the time they were assimilating here in Canada. And also we are discussing all these things, and all the time they are similar, absolutely. You see, all these difficulties, all these girls' problems. Thank you.
And that's nice, because it also builds empathy when you read from all different people's points of view, and you see how many things we have in common with other people.
Thank you. So, Pani Skrypuch, what topics are you currently exploring, or other books that you're working on? I think our audience would really enjoy hearing you comment on this question.
So I was going to be writing the companion novel to WINTERKILL, but my heart can't go there right now with the war in Ukraine. So I've gone back to a project that I had kind of set aside because of the popularity of my World War II books. Because I wrote 6 World War II books in a row. And so the one that I'm working on right now is Roxolana. So set in the 1500s, and but not the part of, you know, the story that everybody focuses on, because like the ending is when she meets Suleiman. I'm more interested in her life as a kid, and like before her capture and after her capture. So that's what I'm working on right now, and I'm having, dare I say, fun with it, because, like, you know, I'm talking about a person who's captured as and becomes a slave, but still it's just fascinating to be writing, you know, in the Middle Ages, when the part of Ukraine she was from was Red Ruthenia, and you know, thinking of even the geography of the time and the war that's going on now and what the geography of the time was back then. So that's what I'm working on.
Well, okay, Pani, Angie, you have just one more question. Please go ahead.
I would like to address discussing the war with children. It's called violence. And I don't know why we're reticent to talk about the war with children, war in Ukraine with children. They come home and they turn the TV on and they're watching all kinds of stuff that's full of violence. Our children are playing video games that are full of violence. A lot of the books that they read, fiction books, are full of violence. But now let's not give them a story about something that really happened, because it might, I don't know what it might do, but quite frankly, my grandchildren live with much more violence in their life than I did.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see it visually in my home. I didn't see it on TV. I mean, I lived through the Cold War, so I lived through a different kind of violence. And by the way, I lived in a communist community, 50% Russian, 50% Ukrainian. And so I understand what you're talking about. But I had lots of fear of the Soviets, but I didn't feel the violence. But our children, and their schools are locked. Never happened when I went to school. My children didn't have locked schools. You know, they get on a bus and somebody gets on a bus with a gun. There's all the school killings in the US. It just goes on and on. And I live in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Our farm is like 15 minutes away from James Smith Reserve. We were in lockdown. You were in lockdown. We were in lockdown. We were miles away from, well, kilometers away from what was going on. And now we're not going to talk about the violence in Ukraine. So there is that filtering of, oh, well, you know, that's way over there. And who knows if it's.
But Angie, I agree with you totally. And I think that kids do have to hear about this. And that's why I write about kids in war.
Yes,
so
thank you.
That is exactly what I write about. And people will say to me, why are you writing these violent books? And I don't write violent books. I write about regular people plunged into a time that they didn't choose. And how do you problem solve yourself through it? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But kids are living in violent times. Kids go out to recess. They go home at lunch, and they are confronted with more violence than we as adults would even want to contemplate. And so if we don't give them something in book form that can give them tools to emotionally and just like somewhere that they can deal with those problems, then what kind of responsible civilization are we? And so that's exactly why I write this kind of book. And I've told kids this myself. I said, like, they say, you must love war. And I said, no, I like to write about regular people who step up. Because I said, I could just follow around you every day. I could write everything that you did every single day. And don't get me wrong, but that would probably be really boring. But if all of a sudden a war happened right now where you are, and you did something to help all your neighbors. You got them into a safe place. You were able to organize food for them. And I was writing down everything that you did. That would be interesting, right? But it's beyond interesting. Like, I'm writing it as something that is entertainment, but it's also infotainment, because what it does is it gives skills to the readers, because then they can problem solve. They can think of what they would do in that situation. They can think about that, because if we never talk about it, if we avoid that, then how are our kids going to think through that problem? So I agree with you 100%, Angie. But it's also why I write for children and not adults, because in adult fiction, a dead body is usually the premise of a mystery. In young people's fiction, the dead body is the person that you're telling the story from the point of view of. So, like, I would rather tell a story through the point of view of the person experiencing being victimized, rather than using the victim as a prop. So that, by definition, is books for young people, not adult fiction. So adult fiction comes in two different categories. There's the literary fiction, i.e. the ones that you read before you go to bed so that you fall asleep really well. Or there are the commercial fiction, which is, if it's history, then it's historical fantasy, because they never did a stitch of research and you're just reading it for the sex. So, you know, there's the two different kinds of adult fiction, and I'm just not interested in writing that at all. Let me write a nice meaty story with as few words as possible in as simple language as possible. And I'm, you know, happy as the day is long. And I can't help but write that, because that's what I like to read too. And, you know, my natural voice is of a 12-year-old. So that's what I write.
On this positive note, I would like to once again thank you, Pani Skrypuch, for your important work of raising awareness of important issues such as the Holodomor, in particular amongst the younger generations, and for the vibrant discussion that we've had today. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us here today. And please do stay tuned for future events. There will be quite a few of them coming in December. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.